So I will just, without any further ado, turn the time over to Clark Quinn. Clark.
Very much, Chad. And thank you all for braving the elements to get here. I'm honored that you'd be here. The way it was introduced about us being outcasts, but I think we are at the bleeding edge, and we have the scars to prove it. It struck me funny yesterday as my flight here was canceled, and the airline finally flew me into Columbia, and I rented an SUV. Well, I didn't intend to. I intended to try and take a shuttle or a bus, and the shuttles and buses weren't going to make this trip last night. They were too worried. So I was going, okay, I got to rent a car, and I'm going to try and make it through the snow to get here. And when I got there, and I looked, and actually a small SUV was cheaper than actually renting a car for some reason, and I was very thankful. I thought, well, at least I have something that's going to handle the snow better. Just rain. And they shut down the airport. So now I don't know if I'll get out of here tonight, but that's a different story. Which is okay. Chad accused Dennis of a little hyperbole. Well, I'm going to throw that back on Chad because I'm actually not talking about technology. I like technology. I'm a geek. I love the shiny object, but I'm really talking about design. I'm talking about and lessons for design from games. I'll make that clear. But I do get to tease Dennis too, because he said that the first successful personal computer was the IBM PC. Apple II.
Commercially successful.
It was commercially successful. They sold a lot of them. They built a whole company. They not business computer. Now, if you're saying first successful personal business computer, I'll agree with you. Fair enough. Okay. I can pick nits. Yeah, but conceptual clarity is important, and that's something I like to talk about. So I like to start with a nice, calm image. Now, my normal nice, calm image is a frost-covered field in Yosemite. I didn't think that would be everybody be welcome to see that at this point. So this is a nice calm image. So I like a calm image to get us open our minds and get relaxed for learning to happen before the carnage begins. So are you ready? Do you think when people play games, whether racing game or war game or simulation, role-playing, massive role-playing, are people learning? They're learning a lot. Learning how to navigate the interface, learning about the rules and the underlying relationships that govern how this world behaves that is embodied in this. They learn a lot. And if you listen to people like James G., Clark Aldrich, David Williamson, Schaffer, the list goes on. Games are, in some sense, the most optimal learning environment. They're tuned so you progress. They keep you deeply engaged by being pitched at just the right level. They create great experiences that motivate you to learn. And so what I want to talk about is how do we do this? How do we tap into that? How do we take advantage of that in our design of learning? So that's what I'm talking about today. You guys with me now? So, gaming as if you mean it. You're designing meaningful practice. And what I like is that, the reason we're here in Immersive Learning University is we have tools that let us tap into some of this. But we want to make sure we take the maximum advantage of it. So that's what I want to go through today. A little bit, just a wee bit of experience with games. My first job out of college was designing and programming educational computer games on the Apple II, hence my slight bias. And the TRS-80 and the Atari and eventually the IBM PC as well. I went back to grad school because I wanted to understand how do we design these systematically, reliably, consistent. What are the principles we need? Because we were designing it sort of ad hoc, and I wanted to understand a bit more. So I went back to get a degree and ended up building a game based upon my PhD research and I did a game for Children's Welfare Agency. We'll talk more about that. And a variety of things over the course of the years. It's just been a recurrent theme. But along the way, I took time to think systematically about it. And what you'll hear is what my academic research framework came up with that we can apply to systematically design it. I want you to understand a little bit about my twisted background so you understand the strange way I look at the world, understand the filters I'm bringing to bear. I went back to graduate school to get a PhD in what was effectively applied cognitive science because I wanted to understand how we really learn. And along the way, I looked at behavioral learning, I looked at cognitive learning, I looked at social learning, I even looked at machine learning just to see if there was any lessons we could do. And then I got interested in design. How do we apply these principles? Because I don't want to do the pure cognitive research. I'm glad that they do that, but I want to apply it to design a solution, particularly to meet organizational performance needs. So that, along the way, it's led to a lot of things. Dennis was rightly talking about mobile, and the directions, and I think that should be a question we should address in the panel later is, what are these next future technology directions? But I've done strategy and mobile and games and a variety of other things tied together that all emerge from this principle, but gaming has just been a recurrent theme. I want to situate this in the broader picture of how we can be using technology to support organizational learning. Because we can be doing performance support, we can be doing social learning, we should be doing mobile and deeper architectures underneath, but what games and what we're talking about, immersive learning, fit in the improved instructional design, going beyond. When we first started doing e-learning, it was content on the web with a quiz or a virtual classroom. But both were essentially replicating the standard framework. But we now have the ability to understand more about how we learn and use technology to support it. And we could start putting in improved instructional design. So this is part of my strategy picture. That's where we're at. Within improved instructional design, we have elements of providing not just introductions, but compelling, emotionally relevant introductions that help us viscerally understand why what we're going to learn is important. Concept representations, they should be having a framework, a model to be applying to the learning that guides their performance. They should see examples where somebody models applying that concept to a context. They should have practice where they apply that concept to the context. And that practice should be then guided to link what the learner does back to that concept. And eventually we have a graceful exit. Well, what games really are, and what immersive learning experiences really are, is about deep practice. And so that, I just want to drill down and show what are we talking about. We're trying to give learners a chance to apply that knowledge, to make the decisions in the learning environment that they want to make out in the real world. So let me ask you, what makes an effective practice experience? And here's a hint, when I put a question up like this, I want your, please.
It has to be relevant.
Has to be relevant, so you have to care about it. Yes?
The tools and systems and structures that you need to be available.
So you need to have the resources there. So it's similar, the learning environment is similar to the way you're going to actually perform in the real world. Yes? Please.
The learner has to actually want to participate.
It helps if the learner is motivated, yes. They understand why it's important. Well, if you look across learning theories, you will find a repeated list of elements that are critical to practice. Not all of them appear in every learning theory, but they all appear again and again. So if we look at constructivism or Van Marenboer's four-component instructional design, Vygotsky, cognitive apprenticeship, anchored instruction, behaviorism, microworlds, you'll see these emergent principles. Clear goals. The learner has to know what they're trying to achieve. Appropriate level of challenge. If it's too difficult, they get frustrated. If it's too easy, they get bored. Contextualize. They're performing in an environment that has similar features to the environment they're going to be expected to perform at. Anchored, in that what they do affects the outcome. And relevant, in that they care about that outcome. Active, They have to make deliberate choices. You know, one of the things that drives me nuts are those things that say, roll over here to find more information, or here's a question, roll over to see the answer. If they're not having to commit to choose between, they're not invoking the cognitive processing that will lead to the outcome. Manipulation, they should operate on the world in the same way in the learning experience that they'll operate in the real world. And rapid and appropriate feedback doesn't always have to be rapid. Michael Allen says this elegantly. And their attention needs to be maintained throughout the learning process. Okay? So we're going to keep that framework on hold for a minute, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. But I want to start with what makes an experience engaging. Now, anybody here not have something they do outside of work for fun? Or if anybody raised their hand, you have to leave, go out, get a life, then you can come back, right? But those things you do, whether it's a sport or a craft, whatever, what makes that engaging? Why do you do it? Fun? What makes it fun? Right, there's something you can achieve. You get to choose. Is it too easy? Sorry? Master the skill? Challenging? Pleasurable.
Some sort of satisfaction.
Satisfaction? Is it always just easy or? No.
Not too hard, but it's not too easy.
Not too hard, not too easy, exactly. It's at the right balance level. Do you want to just observe it, or do you want to be in doing it? Sometimes, movies and theaters you observe, but, how many of you have ever gone and done some acting or improv where you've actually had to be challenged? Right. Or a sport, or whether it's independent like fishing or golf or anything, you don't want to sit on the bench when the game's going, right? You want to be in there. So there was a period when I was a grad student, this game came out called Pinball Construction Set. And it was wildly successful. And the interesting thing is, people used it, but they didn't really make good pinball games. I don't know how many of you remember that game, or remember hearing about it? A couple of you. But what it was the first instance of an interface. The way you used it was, you had a sort of a blank pinball thing, and you could decorate it with colors and shapes and stuff. But then there was a palette of flippers and bouncers and spinners, and you dragged and dropped them onto the pinball framework to create your game. And it turns out that was the first commercial, consumer available drag and drop interface anybody had ever seen, because it was running not on a Mac, it was running on an Apple II. And the interface, people who were interested in interface design, which included my PhD advisor, wanted to know what was so compelling about this experience. And they started looking at experience in general. And there's a number of different fields that talk about experience. Theater and film design, story writing, Csikszentmihalyi's stuff about flow. I don't know how many of you have heard of that. The list goes on. And when you look at these examinations of what makes compelling experiences, a number of elements appeared. Not all of them appeared in all of them, but a number of them showed up again and again and again. So if you look at magic, interesting, so Brenda Laurel talked about what makes theater engaging, and Bruce Tognazzini went on, because a lot of people have talked about transparency. He looked at stage magic. What makes stage magic so compelling? He says, you don't want to know how the trick's done. It's the magic that's really fun. You hide the underlying stuff, so forget that transparency stuff. Interesting side flip. Direct manipulation, user interaction, fiction. And what you see are these repeated elements. A clear or emergent goal. There was one game, deja vu, where you wake up with amnesia in a bathroom. And you have to figure out why you're there and what's happening. So you don't know your goal yet, except you have a goal, and then it becomes another goal, because then you find out there's a crime and you have to go solve it. And if you figure it out, you go to the police commissioner, and if you tell him the right suspect and the motive, you win the game. Thematic coherence. There's a story, and you don't break the story. If you ever been watching a movie and seen an error like a boom microphone come in a badly made movie or something, it breaks it. Okay. There are small variations on this. So Mel Brooks can have a Western barroom fight spill out into the movie set cafeteria, but the man is a genius, and you shouldn't try this in your own home, okay? Balance challenge. Can't be too easy, too hard. Meaningfulness. What you're doing, you care about. And that's a problem to learn. And action to domain. So you care about it. So if you're playing basketball, you like the game of basketball, and you're playing a role. You don't want to be sitting on the bench. Choices of action. So choice, you can choose to do this or that, or at least the appearance of it, as Brian Laura pointed out. Direct manipulation, you're operating on the world and the way the world works. And this coupling, the world responds in ways that are consonant with the way the world would respond. So that's called... Steve Draper coined this term, input-output interreferentiality. And it's a really unwieldy term, but it's a really important concept. Basically, it's you operate in the world in ways that make sense in the world, and the world responds in ways that make sense in that world, whether it's the real world or not. And novelty. It can't be entirely predictable. Now, some of you may have noticed there's something interesting about this list and the previous list. They're the same list. There's an exact correspondence between what makes effective education practice and what makes an engaging experience. And if you understand this, you can create learning experiences that are compelling. And this is why computer games work when they work, because they're learning experiences that balance these elements. Well, they have the elements on the right. It just so happens that they're also providing meaningful practice. This is also why edutainment's a bad word, because people who don't understand the alignment and try and put game designers and instructional designers in a room together and expect the output to be successful, if they don't understand this alignment, it's not going to work. And there's a lot of chocolate-coated broccoli, as they say, or vitamin-infused sugar cereals. A lot more of those, but those actually aren't nutritious, so it's not necessarily a great idea. So this, to me, is why I say the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Now, it's hard to do good education practice. How many of you have ever taken a quiz where the alternative to the right answer is so stupid you didn't have to really understand the material? And it breaks my heart every time I say this. The entire audience goes, yes. What are we doing wrong? It's nuts. It's also hard to do good engagement. The average successful Hollywood movie pays for 5 to 10 failures. The average successful computer game pays for around 20 to 50 failures. Now, the reasons are not because they don't know how to do it. It's because of ego and greed and restrained budgets and all sorts of things that can go wrong, putting too many writers. But it's hard to do well. Doing the two together may be even harder, but the whole is greater than some parts. You really will get something that works if you do it. And if you understand the alignment, it's not as hard as it would be if you didn't. This is why I say learning should be hard fun. If you're doing it right, learning should be hard fun. The question then becomes, can we do this reliably, repeatably? Because if we can't do it reliably, repeatably, it doesn't matter. But can we? That's the question. Now, I don't think people here have as much problem with terminology as the broader populace, but I'm going to be clear about these terms in my mind, because if nothing else, it gives you a framework to help go back and clarify with other people. Because people don't understand what's the difference between a simulation, a scenario, and a game. Technically, a simulation is just a model of a world. It doesn't include the entire world, or it would be the world. It's simplified, but it has some relationships that state what happens if you do this and that. And it can be any legal state, and you can take it to any other legal state. So if you have a simulation of a nuclear reactor, you should be able to, start it in a particular state and manipulate it and see what happens. And a motivated and self-effective learner can use a simulation to get what they need. They can. They'll go in there and they'll manipulate it and learn the relationships they know they need to do. That's not going to be your novice, by the way, and but that's not the way to bet. So what do we do as learning designers? We put that simulation in an initial state, and we ask the learner to take it to a goal state. And we have chosen those that they won't be able to get there until they have learned the relationships they need to learn. And we typically wrap a story around that. That's what I call a scenario. And then we tune that into a game. A game is just a scenario that we have tuned until the feedback and the pressure and the timing get us into that zone. And you don't always have to do that. In business, we have some sticks as well as carrots. We don't have to make it so engaging you'd pay $50 for the opportunity to play it, unless you're doing this as a commercial business. But there are advantages to doing this tuning. You can say you have to do this, you're not going to get your bonus until you complete this stuff, compliance training, whatever. But if you do this, at least some of this tuning, the learners are going to learn faster because you're now optimizing it. If you're optimizing the challenge, they're learning at the optimal rate. And they're motivated, so they have a higher likelihood of completion. So there are reasons to do this. You don't have to do as much window dressing around it. Okay, are you with me so far? Any questions along the way? Because I have time, I'm probably not going to get so wound up, and I'm sleep deprived as well. This is still just after 6 in the morning my time. But sometimes I get passionate, I speak fast. And if you miss something, or if I say something that isn't clear, and you don't stop me and ask, it's not my fault. Because I don't know what you're not understanding. So please, yes.
Again, say the difference, just go over simulation scenario.
Simulation is just the model of the world. A scenario is when you put it in the initial state and the goal state and ask the learner to get there. By the way, a branching scenario, the type of stuff that Extern does, there the model of the world is implicit in the links, not explicit in a set of relationships. But it's a great approximation. It still gives you that experience, the ability to make the decisions you need to make. It's just it doesn't have an engine underneath, so you can add some probability to it and get infinite replay. But what you can do, much easier, is make several scenarios that will give you sufficient practice. So that's the trade-off. So the scenario is initial state and a goal state. Simulation is just the model that can drive that. And then a game. But we can tap into, and we're going to talk next about how do we take the elements of game design to make our scenarios more compelling. So, and thank you for asking questions. I'm absolutely happy. And the nice thing is we have time, and we'll still have time for a coffee break before the next session. So, anything else? All right, let's rock on. So how do we do this? Reliably, repeatably. It's design. I love this quote. The proper study of mankind is the science of design. What we do is we design the world to meet us. That's what separates us in many ways. And then we design solutions that replicate that knowledge through our heads so we don't have to relearn everything fresh. We can help people learn it in more effective ways than random trial and chance. So how do we go about designing? Now, how many of you here have heard of ADDIE? Yeah, okay. In learning design, we typically have a 5-step model. Now, sometimes I give this talk, developers are in the audience, project managers, they have different models. When I went out and looked at design, I looked at graphic design and industrial design and architectural design, software design. I found 3-step models, 5-step models. What I found is a 4-step model that almost everybody can understand, so I don't use ADDIE. I talk about initial analysis of the situation, the design specification of a solution, I talk about development, and I talk about evaluation, and then iterating on this. So those are going to be the 4 stages I use in my reference framework. I hope you guys can work with that. Huh? Analysis, specification, implementation, evaluation. Do you get them? Okay. Look to her notes. So let's start with analysis. What is the information we need to be able to gather to be able to systematically make our experiences engaging, tap into the power of thinking? And in each of these, I'm going to do a delta between what you already should be doing now, what do you already have, and what do you need to gather. So I had a challenge. I knew what I needed, but I didn't have a good language for it. I was still looking for a framework. And then Sid Meier, and if you don't know who Sid Meier is, he's a game designer's game designer. He's one of the game designers other game designers pay attention to. He did Civilization series of games, Pirates. He's well known and well respected. And he once famously said, a good game is a series of interesting decisions. And that finally catalyzed for me how to characterize a good serious game. A good serious game is a series of important decisions. The decisions that they're going to need to make to make your business successful are the ones that you need to be putting in there. So that's sort of the core, and that led to this structure. At the end of the day, you're going to need to replicate this. You're going to need to have a story setting, a context in which these actions are meaningful. By the way, the diagrams are in the deck that's made available for download, so you don't necessarily have to copy them. And you could take a picture of them if you want. Creative Commons, attribution, no charge, share alike. In the story, then a situation is going to occur that forces you to make a decision. And there'll be a correct answer and several wrong answers. And we're going to unpack the elements of this diagram as we go through. For each of those, there will be consequences. Now, if you just stop there, that's just a better multiple choice question. And as I always implore you, at least make your multiple choice questions not knowledge tests, but make them apply the knowledge in a setting. That's closer to how they're going to do it, so you're going to get better transfer, and it makes a much more engaging question than knowledge dump, knowledge test, totally abstract. So, now if you just stop there, you have better multiple choice question, but typically decisions travel in packs. They're related, and when they're going in the real world, particularly if they get the wrong choice, there's consequences. And so we go back and the situation has changed and leads us to a different decision. And this is effectively what a branching scenario, whether that's hardwired or whether that's driven by an underlying model simulation, you get the same experience. In a story, you're faced with something happens, you have to make a decision to do it. And all games are this. You might have a really wide variety of choices. You can go over here, in the military simulation, you can go attack, you can retreat, you can do things. It seems endless, but really it's much more finite than you think. So it's the appearance of choice, but there are a number of choices. Or, in a driving game, I can accelerate, I can decelerate, there's choice. But it's somewhat limited. So that's really the core structure of all games. Now, I want to start off by saying I'm not interested in better fact remembering. And I will suggest to you that your organization is not going to benefit, by and large, from people remembering a bunch of facts. People are going to be more effective in their workspace by making better decisions. Increasingly, the differentiation between the successful organization and the unsuccessful one is not optimal execution. It's continual innovation. Dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty in situations you see less and less, and that comes from model-based decision-making, not from rote practice. So, I want to focus on skills. So the first thing you have to do is go out and find out what skills. Now here's a problem. Subject matter experts, the people you go to find out how this is done, they don't have access to it. Turns out the way our brains work, knowledge is compiled away. Richard Clark at the University of Southern California estimates about 70% of what an expert knows isn't accessible to conscious introspection. They can't tell you what they do. They literally cannot tell you. So what they do is you either create stories about what they do that bear very little correlation to reality, or they tell you what they learned, because they do have access to all the explicit knowledge they learned. And so they come and say, oh, they need to know this, and they need to know this. And the good instructional designer goes, okay, I'll make sure they know this, and they know this, and they know this. And then the learner can recite back this and this and this, and it's not going to lead to any meaningful change. So you have to work a little better and actually use that decision framework with subject matter experts. What decisions do they need to make that they're not making now? What decisions? And if you keep getting in and focus back on the decisions and what the right answers are and the wrong answers, and ask for stories about it and focus on context and what happens really in war stories, you have a better chance of getting at the important stuff, not the facts. It's not easy, and there's more responsibility on the designers now, but if you want the learning to make a difference, you're going to have to do this. There are consequences to your actions. So the first thing you have to do differently than what you've already done is make sure you're focusing on meaningful skills. The next one is you've got to find out the consequences of choices. What are the things that happen? Because if they get it wrong, where do they go? Now I'm going to cheat. Okay, yeah. Right, so there's consequence. You need to trap these, but not just for when they get right, because you need to know what happens, and sometimes, and how variable it is. Is it always the case? I'll bet you it depends on the mood of the boss sometimes, whether you'll get approval to do X, Y, or Z. Now, if you're modeling it, but you want to know the consequences, but also, where do they go wrong? People don't tend to make mistakes randomly. They tend to make mistakes systematically, based upon wrong models they're bringing in. We base large of our decisions on models of the world that are explanatory. Oh, that happened because of X, or predictive. I think Y will happen. And people bring in the wrong models. So you see patterned mistakes, misconceptions. And you can tell them when somebody goes, no matter what I do, every time they go out, they still keep doing this. But now that's useful to you. This is where your subject matters are expert. They can tell you where people go wrong. And that's what you want as the alternative to the right answer. You don't want random stuff. You don't want silly stuff, unless you've run out of reliable misconceptions. But you want all the ways they can go wrong that they reliably do. And this is beneficial two ways. One is it helps you make the challenge appropriate. Oh, both of these alternatives look plausible. Or this one sounds more plausible because I have the wrong one. Now, so the benefit is making the challenge there. But the other thing is now you have a chance to address it. They make this mistake because they don't get it yet. And now you have a chance to tell them why that's wrong. Now I hate the ones that have the world come in, suddenly, essentially God comes in and says, that was the wrong answer. No, let the world tell them, because in the real world they're going to need to be looking at clues in the world to find out if the answer is right or wrong. So have the world communicate the consequences that are played out in the story you're telling them, should tell them whether the answer was right or wrong. But you want to identify all the ways for each decision they can go wrong and why that's wrong, so you can help them understand why and later remediate. You need to understand where in the world these decisions happen and all the settings that they could happen. Somebody give me an example of something you develop a branching scenario about. Come on. Negotiation? Huh? Coding skills. Coaching skills, sure. Now, coaching can happen in the workplace with an employee. It can happen between a manager and a frontline worker. It can happen between an executive and a manager. It can happen on a sports team. It can happen with your kids. So there's a lot of settings. Try and collect as many as you can. because this gives you different settings you might tap into. Most of the time, there's a strong belief, well, wow, we have to make the scenario exactly as close to the real world as possible. Let me tell you why this isn't always the case. Imagine something like coaching or negotiation that can happen in a lot of places. You can negotiate with your boss for a raise, you can negotiate with a vendor, you can negotiate at the store for a personal purchase, you can negotiate with your kids, you're not supposed to, but you do anyways. If you make that too concrete to one, you're not going to get transfer. If it's all about negotiating with a boss for a raise or just with negotiating with the vendors, it would be helpful other places, and yet you're limiting it because you're only going to do transfer likely. The likelihood of transfer is going to be all the contexts you've seen it in. So if you want to facilitate further transfer, you can give broader ranges of context. Another thing you might do is set it in a fantastic setting. So I'm having senior moment. There was a company that was famous for setting business simulation in a Wild West saloon. I did a game on project management, terraforming planets. Just a little level of exaggeration. But that helped decouple it from the immediate context, which with appropriate scaffolding can actually make it more broadly applicable where it can be. So the notion of using fantasy story settings, tapping into popular culture, and can be not only fun and engaging, but also support the transfer, but you have to be explicit about how you're going to make that transfer happen. But having more settings gives you more story opportunities. And if you're going to do multiple scenarios to give sufficient practice, setting them in different settings can be a great way to facilitate transfer. And finally, the other thing you need to find out is, why is this interesting? What do the learners enjoy? So it's not just what do they know now and what do they need to know, but what motivates them. And here's where your SME is a gift. They're doing, why are they experts in it? They've spent arguably 10,000 hours doing this. They shouldn't do that if they don't find something intrinsically interesting in it. Let me tell you a story. I was teaching at the University of New South Wales, and one of my colleagues came to me and said, "Clark, you do this game stuff," because I've done some games and written on it. I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, we're doing a game. Would you like to help?" I said, "Sure." "What's it about?" "Computer auditing." I don't know if I audibly groaned or my eyeballs rolled up, but I go, I think I'd rather have my teeth pulled without anesthesia. He said, "That's what I thought." But then I talked to the people who do it, and they told me it's like playing detective. Sometimes you make an error, and what you do is there is an error. When you're looking and you find an error, and you track back. And most of the time, it's accidental, but every once in a while, it's deliberate. Well, then we had the story right there. So there's this bank, and there's an error, and you track back, and you find out this vice president has introduced it because his mistress who worked at the bank was fired, and he was getting back at them. A little scandal always helps, exaggeration. But the point is, you wouldn't have known that. But these people do this stuff. Find out what makes it interesting for them and bake that into the game, into the learning experience. Help make it clear that this is what it's about. You do two things. You help tap into it for those people who are suited, and you kind of help filter out the people who shouldn't be doing this for a living. So, now pragmatically, I often talk about this to a wide range of people. And on very big projects, you're going to have lots of interim representations. But on small projects, typically before you go investing in the actual development, it's helpful to get sign-off on what you're going to be building it about. So I typically try and have what I call a concept document, which stipulates what did I hear about the audience, their knowledge level, and their interests now. So the interest is new. What decisions are embedded, and what are the consequences of those decisions? What are the misconceptions and the consequences of those? Because if they make the wrong choice, what happens? And is there any way to get back to a good state to continue on, or are you toast at this point? Have you just killed the patient? If the patient's dead, the story is done, right? You failed. And the settings. And I like to get sign off on this. Say, this is what we're going to build it about, folks. And one of my things when I do this on contract, internal is sort of a more funny situation, but I try and say, circulate this to everybody who needs to sign off on it. Get all their feedback together, consolidate it, and give it to me, and I will adjust that once. When I do it in contracts, because otherwise, what happens? How many of you you get some feedback, you make the adjustments, and somebody else then, oh wait, but so-and-so also had this feedback, and you end up getting back where you started, right? So I try and limit that. But now the asterisk is, by the time I've got all that documented, I have an idea for the story setting I'm going to use, the characters, the important variables. So if that happens, rather than then go back and say, okay, now that you sign off on that, here's the story, the characters variable. If it's already coalesced in my head, I'll include that as well and try and only have one round of sign off. Not only do I have all these things, but here's the potential story, character stuff. Give me feedback on all of this, and we've cut out one extra loop of revision. Not always valid, but when you can do it, any pragmatic hints and tips to keep you from spinning your wheels is always a good thing in my mind. So, now we've done the analysis. Time to move to specification. This is, to me, is the fun part. This is the creative part. This is where you get to have fun. And I love this heuristic from Henry Jenkins. He was he'd been a literature type of guy, but he got involved in the stories of games, and he's now a professor at Arizona State, where James G. is as well. Arizona State's growing. Choose a role that the player would want to be in. If you're doing, you can have roles that are less fun or more fun. Are you doing the task or are you managing the task? It's got to be appropriate. They still have to make decisions, but put them in a role where they're making decisions where it sounds like fun to make that decision, where they have a role. And that's just a heuristic, a guideline, but it's a fun one to help think about the user's perspective. Sweat the details. That is the same game. This afternoon I'll be talking about going deeper into the elements that I talked about that contribute to the alignment. And I'll be using this game as an example. Kids who grow up without parents. And yet at age 18, foster care, orphanages, whatever, at age 18 they're released on their own. Whether they're equipped or not. They weren't equipped. The training was idiosyncratic at best, and I'm being diplomatic. So the Australian Children's Welfare Agency had spent all their money on a poster and a video. The aftercare project of that was saying what happens after care, and they had decided this was a problem, and they'd spent their money on a poster and a video and a comic book. And then they realized what they really need, what these kids did who came into the centers where they could get help before they're out on their own, they got on the center's computers and played games. So why don't you make a game? So they came to me and said, we've spent all our money, but could we have a game? Well, I had a very talented student who wanted to do a meaningful honors project. So I taught them HyperCard as part of the interface design, so we decided to build a HyperCard game. And together, we did the design, and she built it. But neither of us were graphic artists. Epileptic chimpanzee with crayons, probably a good mental model. But that's what it looked like. And we actually gave it to them like that. And we had the kids play it, and it was really rewarding. When we first talked, here's the classic expert story. We talked to the counselors and said, what do the kids need to know? And they said, oh, they need to know how to shop and how to cook. Now, that's going to be a fun game, but I could have done it. I have a claim you can't give me a learning objective I can't make a game for, but I reserve the right to raise the learning objective high enough in that sort of taxonomic sense where they're making meaningful decisions with it. But we got a chance to talk to the kids. Actually, not kids in care, but after care. Kids had graduated because they really protect those kids because they're self-esteem and suicidal and stuff. So, and they said, yeah, that stuff's important, but what's really important is you go out and you can get money, at least in Australia at the time, you could get money while you looked for a job or while you went to school, but they won't give you cash. You have to get a bank account, they'll deposit in a bank account. Okay, so you go to the bank to get the bank account. But you can't open a bank account without ID. So you go to try and find ID, and it turns out to get a state ID, you have to pay for it, or you have to get some other form of identification, several letters and things. And what they said, what's really important is all those chains. So that's what's built into the game. And then we got some kids back gave a chance to play it, and the first person failed. And the second person who'd been watching the first person succeeded because she watched the first person. And then a third person had come in, they watched the second person, they succeeded, and the first person demanded a chance to go back and play the game again. Yes, sir. So based upon that success, they liked it, and they asked me to go with them. We went to a philanthropic agency, and we got some money to tart it up. But the play worked first. Then we worried about doing the production values, not the other way around. Sorry. So editorial board. But sweating the details. But this arguably down here looks much more like the environment they were in. There were actually two towns. It was sort of a suburban town, a city center sort of place, and then this one, and then a more rural town that looked much more like, this was in Australia, and so they had both, and they wanted to make sure it was appropriate for all audiences so they could wander between the two towns. They actually had to travel back and forth to get some of the things they needed. And some serendipity. Now, they were aware, Australia has some, people concerned about propriety as well as we do in this country. But the people in the project said, we want them to live. And what happens to these kids out there if they haven't got the skills? They end up having to sell their bodies for money, and they end up often choosing to take drugs, and they don't always do this safely. So they said, build in the chance. Well, we decided, and they approved, to build in the chance for there to be sex and drugs and to have the choice to have clean needles or not, and condoms or not, because we were trying to save lives. That was more important. But this happened not with complete frequency. But you've got to have, and even in a fixed experience, if they happen to get one obscure node that not everybody's going to see, have a bit of fun there. Reward them for having gotten there. What I love about The Simpsons, those little pop culture references, can be a lot of fun. Humor is difficult to test out, particularly if you've got global audiences. Although it appears office humor, specific to people being bad or good at tasks or idiocy in the workplace, is pretty universal because you're doing stuff for people in offices, right? So culture doesn't matter quite as much. Sweat the details. These are three vastly different learning goals, three vastly different looks. This was about marketing, had to look pretty professional. This was putting out fires in software, a little thematic. This one, interestingly, very sparse look. That was deliberate because it was in psychiatric counseling, and they said the psychiatric nurses who were going to be going through these scenarios, if it tries to look real, it will fail and they will get down on it. So strip away all unnecessary detail. This was their choice of what it should look like. But the point is, adapt, get the thematic details appropriate to the context. And it doesn't take a lot. So this was, and err on the side of visuals as opposed to text when you can. So here, we're setting the stage pretty much. There's just a couple phrases you can choose between, so it's not completely deterministic what you get. You have feedback about where you are. You can get data that you need to make decisions is available. As you mentioned, you have the tools and resources available there. But we're trying to communicate a lot more with the look and feel to contextualize it opposed to story. Nothing wrong with a good story, by the way. I like this quote. I'm just reading a book on interface design for learning. It makes the exact same point. Use visuals, and she has the same quote in her book as well. It's the point is to set the setting with as little communication as possible to get away. When I talk about mobile design, one of my principles is the least assistance principle. What's the least I can do for you? And that's not a rude thing. It's because then people can get back to the task. And similarly, don't spend spend the minimum contextualization with graphics and prose that will communicate it. And I suspect this isn't an issue for folks here, but let me just be explicit to make sure that I don't. This is assessment. It's not just practice. Assessment and practice, they're performing, and whether if they're performing before it counts, so they can build up to their level of confidence, or whether you're tracking everything because it won't be held against them, it is practice and it is assessment. It's just whether you decide to make it count or not. But they are performing. This is better assessment than a knowledge test. They're doing stuff like they're going to be doing in the real world. So I don't think there was any doubts about that. And when you have a tool that makes it easy to create a prototype on the way to the full service, but when you don't, you need to capture what you're going to do in a storyboard before it goes to development. So you need to either a wireframe, and this is a ham-fisted one, I'm not a graphic designer, but here you're facing the boss, or the fully rendered. If your team doesn't, if you have the graphic designer and the development team doesn't, you'll have to create what everyone looks like. Not only the dialogue, but also what happens. You want to capture this in a storyboard that has it all. And I think that's built into the environment, I presume, is you can get an intermediate representation, then go polish. Here's something I have learned the hard way, so benefit. If you have it in storyboard format, not actually playable, you capture what it's going to be like, about 10% of the people that are shown it can understand what the experience will be, and there 90% won't, but they won't say it. They'll say, it looks fine. So then you move on and you build it. You go, oh, that's not what I thought it was going to be. This is a problem. So my asterisk here is as a hint and tip, capture the experience in some way. It can be just a prose narrative of what happens. It can be screenshots and say they see this, they choose this, they get here. On big projects, on full games, they'll build it in Flash, they'll build the full experience. It's just not the whole engine behind it. It's just smoke and mirrors. It's just whipped together, but they communicate it. Because then, not only am I showing you what we're building it out of, but we're going to capture the experience for it. Then they come back, that's not what I thought. Well, we couldn't do any more. We communicated the experience to you. If you do the pros, also have one look and feel thing so they understand what it's going to look like. And they'll quibble about that, and that's okay. Give them one round of feedback, but that's it. But I strongly recommend communicate not just the structure, but the experience, and get the sign-off on that. And what we have here, so a flow chart, you get the objectives, you're going to have to analysis, convert them to decisions, find who your audience is, get the misconceptions, brainstorm storylines, and to me that's where you get the concept doc. Now you'll bounce that out to your subject matter experts and clients, whoever. I argue this should be one iteration at most. Get them to consolidate all the feedback. They're the client, even if it's internal, they should consolidate all the feedback. If they give it to you, you might not interpret it right. That's the argument you use with them, okay? Then you go out and you have to create the storyline screens, actually map it into text and dialogue and a look and feel, consolidate so that you have a storyboard or a prototype experience. And then you can send it off to production or start the final, or export it for your testing, whatever makes sense in this environment. And then we'll talk about we really won't talk much about development, but we'll talk about evaluation. So, you guys with me so far? Making sense? Any questions?
That last idea was pretty interesting. I like it. Can you tell us more about, you want the folks to give you the feedback. They want them to consolidate themselves.
Right.
Which is great. So can you go into depth on that a little bit? Just you ask them to fight amongst themselves to come up with a common theme? Because you could have mutually exclusive kind of things.
Oh yeah, that's the problem, is you do get mutually exclusive feedback. That's why I try and put it on them. Typically, the way I've been on it, I'm typically working with my client who has their client. And there's a point person, and good project management says whoever's doing this stuff, needs to have one point of contact with the other one that coordinates the access to the subject matter experts and provides any material you ask for. Many times you need to find out what the corporate look and feel is and make sure you don't violate any of the branding images. Even if it's internal, there'll be all this stuff. You need one person who's representing that for you from them. And they are responsible. So you'll give them the concept document. You'll come over and say, you'll gather all this stuff up and you send it to the client. And they are responsible for sending it to anybody they believe has to see it and has a sign-off. They're stakeholders. That's their responsibility. But they need to get that feedback and make sense of it. Because they're your client. They need to give you the job, the task, I'm having a senior moment. What am I talking about? the requirements, right? So I am saying get them to consolidate, to collect all that and make sense of it. And if there's somebody disagreeing, they need to figure out what makes sense for their job. Then they come back and you do one iteration and say, okay, this is where we're going. If they do it again, that's a scope change and you can charge them for it. That's what I'm trying to do, because too many times I've seen too many people tell stories again and again of getting into this endless cycle of, oh, well, we now want to add this. Fine, it's not in the contract, scope change, guys. And the same thing here, actually. When you get the storyboard, go back, that one loop on revisions, circulate to everybody, they consolidate it. So that's the model. And
So you don't let them come back and mutually exclusive items? You say,
I don't. I try and resist that. So I try and put it into the contract and get it originally agreed that that's what it is. This is just project management 101. Is anything you can to avoid scope change, put the burden on them. The clearer what's acceptable and what's not, the less likelihood you'll end up spending endless money. You go out and look at the tales. There are tales of companies that just went bankrupt because they couldn't manage scope change. There was another question? No? Please.
I just make a comment that this is critically important. You touched on it, expanded the idea a little bit, but this derails more good projects than anything else. And so I'd suggest, just from, we have experienced 1,500 plus projects. 20% of the time, the project gets derailed by this. 60% of the time, you fight with it. And 20% of the time, it goes well.
And the 20% of the time is when you've got somebody, your point person on the other side, who gets this, who's been there and experienced
always
it.
Explain this 5 or 6 times to that person, saying, look, this is critically important. You have to be the focal point of your organization. You have to have all the resources that you're going to need. You have to have every reviewer involved in every review, serially. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't. It's really difficult. This is a key point.
Well, I put it in my contracts. When I have a deliverable, whether it's a game design, process review, anything, I will give you this to you. I do one other thing. I will get feedback within this amount of time, or it's considered approved. Just, because otherwise they can end up spinning off into weeks, just never happen, and the project dissipates, and you need to control that as well. But yes, I think your numbers are spot on. So, thanks for that. Any other before we delve further? No, we're coming near the end. Be able to have questions and coffee break and all those good things. My first point about development is if you don't get the design right, it doesn't matter how you implement it. If you got a bad design, you can have all the production values and deep stuff. How many of you have seen really highly produced games that are tarted up drill and kill and don't lead to any meaningful outcomes? I saw an award winner, I won't mention what award channel, but that was its country fair dressed up to do HR drill and kill. Really won an award, but it was just mindless stuff. If you get the design right, there are lots of ways to implement it. And excuse my small teasing in my editorial comments. Long story behind there. Once you get the core decisions, there are a lot of ways to implement it. And, I love that there is a production level tool and people go, oh, how do I get this done? Everybody wants a tool that will actually produce engine simulation driven experiences, but I want it to be an easy to use tool. And I have a graph that's not in this deck that shows why that's a pipe dream. It's just because the way things can vary so much, you end up having to essentially program the model. And so there can't be. But the next level down where there can be tools are to support industrial strength branching simulation development. And that's, Nextlearn's the only game in town, really. There are other ones lower that have the ability to do scenarios as opposed to other things, but of course, since they're trying to do other things, they're not going to do this as well. Iterate. Even after you get the sign-off, build into your schedule testing and revision. The thing about, waterfall processes, if you're designing for something like a bridge, the properties of concrete are predictable. Concrete and steel. People are not. People change. And so your design is not going to always work the way you think. So get it out there, give feedback. First, and I recommend low-tech prototyping first. Postpone programming, prefer paper. Is my double P's. Test it first with the people not on the team but down the hall, and then test it with, unless you have easy access to your target audience, test it first with just somebody is willing to spend the time but isn't real. First you're going to test it yourself and get all the bugs you can see. Then you're going to test it with other people, get any flaws. This language, this joke doesn't work. I don't know what this phrase means. I wasn't quite clear what the options meant. These sorts of things. Test those, then test it with a small group of your target audience, and then have a pilot test roll out. If you can, this is the way to get it right. So you test and evaluate, and you go back and you refine your design. Will Wright is another one of the game designers. I happened to talk to him because a bunch of companies were coming to him. Well, first, somebody came to me and said, "Can we do, sim company?" And I said, "Probably," but so is Electronic Arts doing this? So I managed to actually call up Will Wright and talk to him for a while on the phone. He said, "We did that. We built a whole division of our company to build sim companies on contract basis, and it failed." He said they didn't get it. Now, you have to understand SimCity is complex programming. Multi-layer cellular automata collected by rules. To build all the elements of the whatever simulation you're doing and connecting it that way, just to do a sim type of thing specifically for companies, is complex. So they'd spend $1 million and you'd go, okay. And they'd go, we're done, right? You've got the first version up. You go, no, you don't understand. Tuning is 9/10 of the work. And all those deals fell through because they weren't willing to do the other 9/10 of the work. Now, Will Wright's genius is he takes an idea like city planning or evolution and manages to build an entire game around it and tune it until it's compelling. Now, you don't necessarily have to tune to a commercial level of experience where people will pay $50 for it, as I've already said. But you do want to tune it and get the bugs out so that the experience flows, because that's going to optimize learning. So you will need some tuning. Learning can be hard fun. I want to suggest if you get these principles, you can be creating learning experiences that are compelling, engaging, not easy fun, not trivial, relaxing, but hard fun. Where I'm going, oh, I didn't know. Yes, I got it. Nicole Lazaro, I think, talks about different types of the emotional experience. And Fierro, one of those fiery ones, is of accomplishment is an important component. So, learning should be hard fun and can be hard fun. Thank you very much.